somewhere else. A good example of that, in my view, is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In fact, 57 countries, most of which are our friends and allies, actually agreed to participate as charter members of the bank. Our initial reflex was really to think this was not in our interests, and we tried to persuade at least some of our friends to the wisdom of our point of view, which was not successful. I think we should have looked at this as the world needs infrastructure, Asia needs infrastructure, we need financing for it, and anybody who wants to contribute to that, more power to them.
While some experts compare Xi's state visit in 2015 to Deng Xiaoping's in 1979, most say that Xi's visit is the more challenging. At the top of the list is cybersecurity, with charges and countercharges escalating for months. U.S. spy chief James Clapper referred to China as one of the most active sources of espionage, targeting a broad spectrum of U.S. interests. But then, on both sides, perhaps some signs of tempering. To ease tensions just days before his state visit, Xi sent his special envoy Meng Jianzhu, Politburo member and head of public security, to the U.S. Meng met with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Homeland Security Jed Johnson, and U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Both sides reached important consensus on combating cybercrime. Frank exchanges seem to produce progress in combating cyber crimes.
Cybersecurity, accusations of cyber attacks, has become one of the most contentious issues between the U.S. and China. China, of course, points to the revelations of Snowden and the spy planes that frequently travel near Chinese territorial waters and near the mainland. The U.S., of course, has accused China of launching very significant cyber attacks against the U.S. government and against many American corporations. How, from your perspective, from the Chinese perspective, put the whole issue of mutual cyber attacks into context?
就是这个网络的问题呢，我认为中国、美国都是共同受害者，包括现在美国这个窃取的一些盟友啊，这个英国、法国他们领导人，说大家都是网络的共同受害者。现在应该什么？应该制定一个网络规则啊，就像当年我一开始说咱们讨论的这个核安全的问题讨论的比较多，当时就认为核对我们大家构成了威胁，所以制定了很多这个限制核武器啊、限制核发展的这些规则。那么现在是不是网络也要制定一些规则？
It's not just a government-to-government problem, but it's becoming a society-to-society problem. Of course, Snowden, when he revealed what he revealed, I think concerned many Chinese people beyond the government there. So this conflict, you might say, between our two governments is seeping into the larger attitudes there.
It's also an issue that's very hard to coordinate within a government.
Yeah.
And somewhat the irony of this is, unlike most issues, the higher you get up in each government, generally the more you're dealing with decision makers who themselves don't understand the issue. I think that you cannot argue to the other side that that is not my intention and have the other side believe it.
The best way to address serious problems is to really understand them. So let's take the problems first. Could you lay out the specific differences in specific, and if you can, in order of importance in terms of the emotionality of the moment, so that we have on the table the totality of the differences?
As a matter of fact, the first and foremost should be the trust deficit. Both China and the United States, we have these problems. And from China's perspective, China is pretty much sensitive to Americans' military deployment around Asia Pacific, and also its efforts in strengthening its allies in the region. And so there is a lot of kind of debate also in China how to view this, how to look at this issue. Of course, from American perspective, they are very much concerned about the possible challenge proposed by China to its supremacy, its leadership in the region and in the world at large. So I think this kind of distrust between them, it needs to be addressed.
The general narrative in China is that the U.S. policy overall is to contain China's rise, and the general narrative in the U.S. is that China has some sort of an aggressive or expansionist intent in their rise. How do you deal with these overarching narratives that are propounded by media in both countries?
I think that you cannot argue to the other side that that is not my intention and have the other side believe you. Both of us have said to each other for years, on the Chinese side, our rise is peaceful. We do not seek to displace the U.S. from Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And on the U.S. side, we have said that we engage with China to facilitate or welcome China's successful development and seek to cooperate with China, et cetera, et cetera. And neither side fully believes the other. The problem with a conspiracy theory is that you can never disprove a conspiracy theory. Well, I have pointed out things to these interlocutors in various occasions where, what the U.S. has done is clearly, in America's eyes at least, been helpful to China. Well, we've made choices to be helpful to China. The response just shows how clever you are. Right? And that's what conspiracies theories are like.
They're always self-consistent in their own thinking.
I think it's that kind of mutual suspicion about long-term intentions that is frankly very, very hard to construct a logical argument, a speech, an occasion that really dispels that. So I think the way you get at that, insofar as you can, is through concrete cooperative efforts.
As you see China's diplomatic moves over the last few years, we see a much more engaged China, aggressive China in the totality of the diplomacy of the world. China is now the primary funder of infrastructure in many countries in the world, in Africa, even Latin America, now Central Asia. What is the implication long-term of this significant engagement that China has with the world, and what does that say about President Xi's foreign policy?
You use the term aggressive. I wouldn't use the term aggressive. I don't see the Chinese as following an aggressive foreign policy. I don't see the Chinese fighting a war like the United States fought in Iraq. I don't see it as consistent either with the policy, the history, the tradition, China's inward focus. So I don't see it. I see that the developments externally have been mostly positive. I mean, look at their work on Iran, on reaching this agreement with Iran. It has been very positive. If you ask Secretary Kerry, has China helped reach this agreement, he would say absolutely, that Wang Yi has been very productive in supporting the efforts to reach an agreement with Iran. I mentioned Syria earlier, the AIIB, the infrastructure investments they're making in places are generally positive. China XM funds projects. Are they benefiting China? Absolutely. Are Chinese construction companies doing it? Yes. But is it aggressive? I wouldn't say it's aggressive. It's putting China in the place where its economy has placed it.
In fact, throughout the history of Sino-U.S. relations, differences have always existed. Thus, managing differences has always been a main task for leaders on both sides. And that's why mechanisms such as the strategic and economic dialogue exist. But experts believe first and foremost, China and the U.S. should enhance mutual trust, and summit like this is a good start.
The U.S. has had sort of this ideological moral commitment to enforce stability. China has had less of that, but actually has more necessity from its own economic condition to see that happening. So that's a natural marriage, not to use force, but to use the strength of two great powers in all of these different countries.
So I would hope our two presidents can give voice to that in a very tangible way, because as two big powers, we have common interests and we have divergent interests, and that's in the nature of the universe. But what we need to do is always make sure that the balance in our relationship is a positive balance represented by cooperation, so that we have some political capital in both societies to weather the strains that inevitably will be there. The search for the perfectly congenial relationship is probably a worthy goal, but unrealistic.
I think no single concession will change the relationship in a broad sense. Again, there's an underlying concern about long-term intentions and different ways of connecting the dots to understand, where things are really headed. So I think it's a difficult issue. Having said that, I think there are areas where we can do a lot. One of those is in the bilateral investment treaty. Investment is different from trade. Real investment on the ground, new business and that kind of thing is different from portfolio investment or buying debt or that kind of thing.
The climate change issue is still out there, and there's room for further progress. So what I don't know is whether the two sides have been working to see whether further progress is possible. In the mill-to-mill area, certainly the confidence-building measures are a beginning, not an end, of what we can do in that area. So it would be helpful if we could see additional. But I think the aspect that would make the visit most useful will not necessarily be totally visible to the outside. And that would be to have constructive discussions on how to deal with cyber issues and how to contain frictions in the South China Sea. In other words, how to bring some of the issues that have been casting a dark shadow over the relationship into a brighter perspective. Because that's essentially what the leaders on both sides want to do. And that's how I would look at it.
The general perception in the U.S. is that China has become aggressive internationally. The general perception in China is that the U.S. seeks to contain China and prevent its natural rise. Conflicting views are exacerbated by the political season blooming in the U.S. and a nationalistic media booming in China. How to assess the summit? The communiqué is key. The more specific, the better. To state issues openly is better than to pretend they don't exist. Will both presidents use the same terms in the same ways, such as new type of big power relations? Certainly there are common interests, economic stability and growth at the top of the list. Also, stopping regional wars, terrorism, climate change, among others. Certainly there are mechanisms to promote China-U.S. relations, including high-level visits, military exchanges, the strategic and economic dialogue, people-to-people contacts. Next week, at the summit in Washington, we'll find out. Let's see who comes closer.